So now I have the great honor and pleasure of introducing our keynote speaker today, Dr. Lewis Williams. And I have to say, I had known of Lewis's presence and work here in London, but last year was on sabbatical, so I didn't have the pleasure of meeting her until just a few weeks ago. And it was amazing, and we are in for a great experience, I know. So Lewis is an interdisciplinary Indigenous feminist scholar practitioner of Ngā Te Rangi Maori descent. I know I didn't say that very well. Her scholarship and practice center on Indigenous resurgence and reconciliation as key means of addressing Indigenous Indigenous disparities and human planetary well-being. An important part of this work is tackling cultural and ecological crisis, including climate change. Growing up in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and initially qualifying and practicing as a social worker and community developer, Lewis has worked and lived within diverse communities and regions in Aotearoa, New Zealand, Turtle Island, Canada, and Australia. Lewis is the founding director of the Alliance for Intergenerational Resilience, a Canadian-based international not-for-profit organization whose aim is strengthening human ecological resilience through the resurgence of Indigenous knowledges and lifeways within all peoples. She's also interim director of the Indigenous Studies program at Western University and an associate professor in the Department of Geography and Environment at Western, Turtle Island, Canada. Yay for us, I have to say. Lewis is the author of the recently released book, Indigenous Intergenerational Resilience, Confronting Cultural and Ecological Crisis. So please help me welcome her.
Bonjour, tēnā koutou katoa, greetings. Thanks. How's that? Nā mihi ki te whenua o te rohi o te Deshkanzibi. Nā mihi nui ki te awa o te Deshkanzibi. Nā mihi nui ki te tūpuna o tēnei wahi. Nā mihi nui ki e koutou kua tai mai nei ki te kōpapa. Nā mihi nui ki te iwi o te Deshkanzibi, ko Chippewa, ko Oneida, ko Munsey, Delaware. Kia ora tātou. Really, I'm happy to be here. The opportunity for me to be amongst artists and activists is it's a great thing. It's a good chance to get out of the intellectual straitjacket. Can be a bit of a straitjacket at times. But I guess for me, one of the really important things about art is that it stirs the soul and it stirs the spirit, and it awakens us. And I think that that's really important in this. And I've just been listening to some of these conversations going back and forth, and I think that the times that we live in really is a calling to awaken the soul, and art does that. In one of my ancestral lineages, which is Māori, I'm also of German, Scottish, and Welsh ancestry, but I'm born of Aotearoa. That's the land I'm from. We have there's a word in Te Ao Māori, the Māori world, and it's called tūranga waiwai. And tūranga waiwai literally means stomping your standing place. So tūranga actually means to stomp, and waiwai are your legs. And traditionally this was related to land. Now it's more about your place of standing, because there's so many displaced people, right? And so we find our places of standing in different ways. But one of the ways that we find this is through our whakapapa, or our genealogical relationships, the genealogy, the living system that we are part of. So as a way of establishing my tūranga waiwai here with you today and talking about what I'm going to be talking about, which is living well with kin, or how to reweave this these fractured relationships with our kin. I'm going to start with a short film. I'm actually in the process of making a larger film about my work, but this short film just tells you a little bit about my tūranga waiwai and where I'm from. So just the next slide.
Io nui, io hoa, io takitaki, io matua kore, io matua. Te kore nui, te kore roa, te kore te pipia, te kore te rauia. Te pō nui, te pō roa, te pō yuri, te pō kirikiri, te pō tangotango, te pō namu, te pō numi ki tai ao, te pō ioti atu, te pō tāhuri atu, te pō tāhuri mai. E rangi ka pū kei waho ki te whai ao, ki te whai ao, ki te ao tūroa, ki te ao mārumati, hei maurua.
Hei kākana waho, e rua mai, e rangi e tea. Ko mātatua te waka, ka maumau te mauna, ko tauranga moana te rohi, ko nā te rangi te iwi, ko rua hini puhi te tangata, ko Lewis Williams, aho. E te taha toko mamā, no na iwi o nā te rangi, me ko te rāna o ku tipuna. E te taha toko papā, no na iwi o wera, me harmony o ku tupuna. I'm standing at the top of our sacred mountain, Mahon, and I'm gazing out over the moana, over the seas, thinking about my ancestors who travelled here. I turn to the northeast and I'm looking out over the great ocean of Kiwa, and I think about their journey from Hawaii through Rarotonga, across the ancient sea paths that would eventually lead my tupuna to this land that would later become known as Aotearoa. I turn to the northwest and I also feel the presence of my Scottish, Welsh and German tupuna. I feel the presence of this interwoven whakapapa that is me. And my blood and my bone is also of them. But I am born of and to this land, this whenua. Through my ancestors is my tūranga waiwai, my place to stand. It has taken me 60 years to get to this place. So I was born in 1961 in Tamaki Makaurau, or Auckland, Aotearoa, New Zealand. And there I grew up as one of 4 children. On my mother's side, my great-grandfather was Edward Sellers, the grandson of Ruahine Puhi from Matapihi, Tauranga. Edward's mother was Jane, one of Ruahine's daughters, and his father, Jane's husband, was Captain Daniel Sellers, a mariner from a village called Imika on the Isle of Arran, Scotland. Daniel left the Isle of Arran, Scotland, sometime after the land clearances there. Edward was born in Tauranga in 1861, just 3 years before the land confiscations, which followed the land wars of Pukahinahina and Te Ranga. Eventually, a fraction of the portion confiscated was returned to Edward's mother, Jane Sellers. So I don't know what happened to that land. We'll never know. But it was some time after that that my great-grandfather, Edward, came to Auckland to make his life. And it was from there that the whakapapa on the Māori side of our family started to become deeply fractured. It wasn't so cool to be Māori in those days, and Edward's son Roy, my grandfather, was ashamed of his Māori ancestry. In those days, the New Zealand government's fascination with blood quantum meant that my grandfather Roy had to, by law, acknowledge his Māori ancestry on the New Zealand census. He told my mother, Shirley, that she was lucky because at 1/8 Māori, it all stopped with him. So the shame about the Māori part of our ancestry, it didn't go away. And my mother recounted a story to me where she remembers that my grandfather, Roy, was having a clean out of the garage one day and he was having a bonfire. And that my grandmother, who was Scottish, being absolutely horrified that my grandfather was actually burning one or two pictures of our Ngātarangi tupuna. So this is, even today, I feel it's a hard story to tell, that one. But of course it didn't go away. We knew we had Māori in us, but there was really nothing more until the reunion of the Scottish side in 1994. And it was actually my mother's mother, who was Scottish, who actually wrote down the whakapapa of Ruawahine and Jane and gave it to me. So fast forward to the very beginning when it changed from 1999 to the year 2000. And I had this watershed dream. It just happened, it just came out of the blue. And in this dream, my tupuna, Jane Sellers, who was Jane Faulkner, daughter of Ruawahine Puhi, she had passed away, and I was going onto the marae to see her. And I had expected that I would pay my respects to her and I would see this Māori-looking woman all laid out in her whānau in Pākehā clothing, because blood quantum-wise, she was half Māori, half Pākehā. But the heart of her, for me, was Māori. So in the dream, I'm walking onto the marae and I come across some rangatahi, some youth, and I say to them, mate, tell them who I am, and have you seen Jane Sellers? I've come to pay my respects to my tupuna. And they look right through me. And so feeling pretty bleak, I go on to the wharekai and talk to some woman there, some wahine there, and tell them who I am, and have you seen my grandmother's casket? I've come to pay my respects. Again, they look right through me. It's like they don't see me. So I wander out of there. In the dream, I wander out of there, and of course I'm just feeling worse and worse. And then finally, over in the long grass, away from the whare tupuna, I see my ancestor's casket. But the lids are all folded down and closed over, and it's cobwebbed. And in the dream, I say, I'm thinking, she's long forgotten. My people have long forgotten me. But even worse, I'm long forgotten to myself. And so for me, I just knew I had to open those coffin lids, and I had to go down that journey of my rangitanga. I didn't know why, but just had this feeling, I must do this. So from there, we did, and I was lucky. My good friend Jane actually knew Auntie Maria and Uncle Kihi Ngātai, who were living at that time, and Uncle Kihi was the rangatira of Ngātarangi. And she introduced me, and they were wonderful. They just opened the gates to me and opened their hearts. And then from there, Auntie Maria introduced me to Auntie Naruamata, who was the queer of the Whareroa Marae of Ngātarangi. And Naruamata also just opened her heart to me, and she would recount to me that she would show our my Ngātarangi and Ngātu Kārangi whalanga my photo, and they would go, he Pākehā ia, she's Pākehā. And she would go, and she's your relative. So I believe that everyone has their own gifts and their own purpose. And for me, with the journey I've taken over the last 20 years and will continue to take, I believe that my journey is about becoming of place, regrowing those connections to place, and showing other people how to do the same. Kia ora.
So, a story about fragmented relationships, some reweaving. In the beginning, you would have heard, would have sounded like a chant. It's called a tauparapara. And it was the voice of Hemi O'Callaghan. He's married to a Ngātarangi relative of mine. And he was invoking the key Māori creation story. What is our creation story? And you would have heard words like, you might, if you can remember, you might have heard io mātua, that's the creator or the root cause, te kore kore, the great void, te pō nui, te pō roa, the long night, the big night, down through several iterations to te o marama, then the world of light, then down to Ranganui and Papatuanuku, the Sky Father and the Earth Mother, and then so forth. I think he stopped at about ke te taio, the living world, the world as we know it, the physical world. But for us, and then from our original ancestors, Papatuanuku and Ranganui, the Sky Father and the Earth Mother, other original ancestors such as Tangaroa, the original ancestor of the sea, Tawhare Matea, the original ancestor of the wind, Tane Mahuta, the original ancestor of the forests and all living beings. So this is a huge, as whakapapa is a huge web that we are part of, and knowing one's place within this whakapapa here, we might say a Turtle Island, within this web of kinship relations is really, it's really a key thing in te ao Māori, and it's really about the reweaving of this and the reweaving of these kinship relations that I want to be talking about. So as you know by now, I'm of both colonised and colonising identities, and through several iterations of displacement. And I guess the reason I've really followed my Ngātarangi tanga is because of the Indigenous knowledge of place and how I think that can help us through these times. So I get it that GardenShip and the state is really about politics, ecology, and culture, and coming together as artists, and what is going to help us through these difficult times in terms of reweaving these kinship relations. Okay. So I think some of you will recognise this painting by Cree artist Kent Monkman? Who does? Okay, wow, okay. So the resurgence of the peoples. Resurgence of the people. So when you look at it, as you take it in, for me it's a really powerful piece of work. It evokes so much. If you wouldn't mind, as you just take that in and you feel that in your beings, what does that evoke? What are the sorts of thoughts and feelings this Ken's work evoke for you? The boat's very full? Okay, thank you, Patrick. Alan? The migration of people all over the world? Thank you. Okay, thank you. So all of that is in this wonderful work. When I look at it, it seems to both carry the theme of Indigenous resurgence, you can see, and the resurgence of Indigenous lifeways and societies, in amongst also a lot of agitation, chaos. You can see these people out of the boat. It's full of migrants. You can see these people also who are paddling hard. It brings up for me climate crisis. It brings up for me the conflict that we're in. I'm not an artist, but just when I take this in, it just evokes so much about our times. And I want to say, we all know and we all feel it, but we are in the midst. We are in the midst of these really unprecedented times, these really uncertain times, these really chaotic times that actually to move us through this predicament, right? It's not a hurdle to get over our cultural ecological crisis. It's a predicament that we're in over our heads. So I want to suggest, and this is going to take some very, really, really deep adaptations and changes on our behalf to generationally move through the predicament that we find ourselves in today. I want to suggest that framing this, the situation that we're in today, which I'll just shorthand cultural ecological crisis, are 4 key existential human challenges. So the first is economic fundamentalism or global neoliberalism and increasing inequities. So I cycle every day up to the university along the Dash Kanzibi, so I see that when I see the tent people. It's right there for me to see. The second one is the unravelling of our ecological and our climate systems. The third is the unprecedented displacement of species, human displacement, country to country, the internal displacement that we have here of people. And then the fourth, which is really underpinning this intensification of colonialism, has been the erasure of Indigenous lifeways, peoples, societies. And not only that, but the erasure of the last traces of Indigenous memory of the long ago, what I call the long ago colonised, or those who are intergenerationally displaced from their Indigenous roots. So this is where we're at from where I stand. And you could almost say that what we're facing now, and this is not to sound hopeless, this is part of the picture, but where we're standing now, I think we're in amongst a superordinate level of trauma, where colonial trauma, right, and the trauma of intergenerational displacement and Indigenous trauma is now ecological trauma. But I think we all have different relationships to this trauma, and this is part of these different relationships and these nuanced identities are really key in how we move through this collectively. Because for me, we're on a collective journey together, whether we want to be or not. We are. This is the beauty of it. Can I have the next slide, please? Yeah. Oh, the next one. I'm not going to talk to that one. Okay. So here, just before we play these, the next two videos represent quite different perspectives on colonialism's intensification, but they speak to the same thing, just from different subject positions. Okay, thanks.
In 2008, a small group of international scholars and activists.
That's all right. Okay, that didn't quite come off. Looks like those slides didn't get put on. Okay, I'm going to tell you what was on those. One is of Louise Half, who's, I don't know if some of you all know her. She's a Métis poet. And she is talking, so as about 10 years ago, as part of some radical human ecology dialogues that I ran with a friend or two across Canada, and they were very much around living well with kin, we had people speaking what that meant. The first speaker is Louise Half, who's a Cree poet in Saskatchewan. And she's talking about her experiences of residential schools, the trauma of being dissociated from her medicine ways, her life ways, and not knowing what happened to her mother. And she talks about the trauma of colonialism hitting the soul and hitting the spirit, and some of her journey through that. The next video that I was going to show you is of a young Métis woman, and she's talking about how education needs to be radically revitalised. And then as she talks more and more, she then talks about that she didn't realise she was Métis for a long, long time. And the trauma or the uncomfortability, the grief that it had raised for her of reconnecting with this part of herself and her Indigenous roots. So she talks about, and her end line is, and there's somewhere I need to go. So if you could see it, you would see the grief coming up in her face, and that's the last thing. There's somewhere I need to go. I think that's a common experience for human beings, and that feeling of there's somewhere I need to go. So the type of more subtle dissociation from the difficulties of these times and the trauma of these times, I think is very common it's more common for those who are more intergenerationally displaced. So knowing the complexity of these subject positions is really key when we think about how can we work together to move through cultural, ecological crisis, both holding the paradox of our different identities, but moving down to more digging through identity politics to address more fundamental issues of epistemology. So I'm going to flip to thinking about this colonial dissociation for a minute. And I don't want to actually talk very much in binaries of settler, Indigenous. I much more prefer Indigenous to place, no longer Indigenous to place, intergenerationally displaced from place, because it's more subtle and it's more nuanced. But one of the things I think that in this collective journey, that I think actually GardenShip in the state, I think that's one way of taking this collective journey through art. That one of the things that may be helpful to newcomers to Canada, and by newcomers I mean people who are not Indigenous to Turtle Island, is a concept that we have. Can we flip to the next slide, please? Okay, here she is. Okay, Alison Jones. So in New Zealand, the word actually Pakeha, it was a word coined by, invented by Māori to refer to the settlers who had fair skin, okay? And it meant settlers from Europe. And as we've matured as a country, or as Māori and Pakeha relations have matured in New Zealand, in Aotearoa New Zealand, the word Pakeha has begun to take on a different thing. So Pakeha, academic activist Alison Jones, talks about what does it take to stand upright as Pakeha, right? So to be able to be with this time of intensified colonialism, and take up one's identity as newcomer or settler and stand upright in that, stand within one's own mana, one's own power. And she says that it's a process of becoming, right? So you're not just Pakeha because you've got fair skin, you're Pakeha because you've grown into the landscape. You've grown into this land in relation with Māori. So becoming Pakeha is something that happens in relationship with Māori. And it's seeing, being of Aotearoa, informed by a Māori worldview. So I don't know if this is helpful for people, if this on your respective journeys. Maybe some of these things will hit the spot, others might not, but maybe pennies might drop at different times. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, that's a beautiful Tāne Mahuta, and if I have time, I'm going to come back to Tāne Mahuta. This is a huge kauri tree in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and of special significance to us. If I have time for the metaphor, I'll come back to Tāne. So we have a huge repository of cultural narratives to draw on to move us through these times. And I'm sure you'll be familiar with the stories of Sky Woman and the creation stories here of the Great Lakes. I'm going to just keep Sky Woman up there while I tell this story, because the story I'm going to tell next is teaching up at Western. and working with the huge challenge this nation faces of murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls. Now, why I'm going to this huge tragedy is because I believe that one of the things that we need to recover in our recovery has to do with the Indigenous life-giving principles, but also the feminine principles. And they are nowhere are they more embodied than in Indigenous women. And nowhere is the non-colonial, non-binary more embodied than in Two-Spirit, Indigiqueer peoples. So here's a story I want to tell you. So I teach a course called Contemporary Indigenous Issues in Canada. This course calls students into the midst of Canada's colonial wreckage, moving from what is to decolonial action, all the while requiring them from their own culturally situated identities to make sense of what it means to live ethically with people and planet. Like most of the classes I teach, members represent a range of Indigenous, settler, racial, ethnic, gender, sexual ability, and generational identities. This matters. So it's been a really tough 2 weeks as we've been discussing the issue of murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirited people throughout Canada. We've also been learning about the ways in which this racialised and gendered violence is tied through colonialism and late capitalism to the fossil fuel industry and, by extension, climate crisis. The ongoing and unresolved colonial violence perpetrated against missing and murdered Indigenous girls and Two-Spirited people across Turtle Island stirs a sea of emotions: rage, grief, guilt, impotency, and I know it has done so in this class. By the 3rd week, I can tell it's time for the class to re-anchor unprocessed sensations and feelings, to find release from the academic disembodied intellectual straitjacket through regrounding in bodies and emotions. At the beginning of the session, we're sitting in a circle, as we usually do, and I ask them to stand and to move the chairs to the edge of the room, and then take some time to walk about, to re-find themselves in their bodies and in this space. As they move past each other, I encourage them to reflect on the past 2 weeks, their experiences and feelings in the class. I suggest to them that through our identities and experiences, we each have a unique relationship to this issue, and that colonisation has left none of us unscathed. I then ask them to place themselves somewhere in the room in relation to the issue, inviting those who see themselves, either because of their identity and/or experiences, at the centre or very close to the issue, to stand in the middle of the room. And I ask the others in the class to place themselves accordingly in terms of their relationship to the issue. Almost instantaneously, a Two-Spirit Anishinaabe woman places herself squarely in the centre of the room. Quite quickly, the space fills around her. It is mainly the Indigenous members, particularly the women, of the class who stand closest in, but not always. 3 black cisgender members of the class, who have each experienced forms of racial violence, also place themselves close by. One coming out to the class as a survivor of sexual abuse. At that point, this woman was so triggered, she actually left the class I couldn't because I was facilitating, but fortunately someone else, a mature member of the class, was able to go after her and be with her. A young cisgender Métis man stands nearby, remembering the Indigenous kin who have gone missing and or are subjected to the sexual violence of colonial heteropatriarchy. While several white, queer and trans people simultaneously place themselves a little further out while recounting their respective connections to the centre. They also have experienced what it is to be relentlessly othered. One young woman, recounting her privilege as a settler, says she has no connection and stands right at the edge of the room. While I think differently, I simply stand with her in her reality of that moment. The space is raw and intimate. Truths are being spoken, and the lingering sense of separateness I'd sensed earlier just dissipates. I remind everyone of our essential grounding as humans in kinship relations, in which all of life is viewed as a part of creation and equally valued. Perhaps just as poignantly, and as I put words to paper now, this is something I've just recently been writing, I find myself echoing post-colonial gender scholar Scott Morganson's words that to honour the earth-centred traditions of creation, which include the fluidity of gender and sexuality, is an act of resistance to the coloniser's insistence that the totality of life conforms to him. Surely it is in this bodily refusal that some of our deepest decolonial agency lies. Ultimately, addressing climate and cultural ecological crisis means joining the dots between the economics of extractivism, human and species hierarchies, and white supremacism. This concentric, this whakapapa worldview demands that we dig deep into the cleavages of an equity, enabling the generative creativity of subjectivities and identities whose voices and actions are disregarded, often disregarded because of their apparent lack of power. So I'm actually saying in this that for me, I think it's within the Indigenous feminist lifeways and principles that at this time, some of our deepest agency lies in moving through these times. And just like my learning moment in the classroom, kinship involves being with the rawness of collective dismemberment and grief while unlocking the thick silences that obscure the identity politics alive in any moment. It breaks through the modernist illusion of separation from one another, which aid and abet the ongoing structures of colonisation. So some of what I'm trying to say there is that, and this is a particular, I think, deep cleavage of societal wounding, is that this requires us to go into the trenches, just as you have been doing with your artwork. And it requires us to be with, and it's something I'm really passionate about, because in my own family we had such differences, and yet we've managed to keep the connections. And I think these times require us to keep the connections across the diversity of the differences in culture and power, to hold that paradox while digging down to these really fundamental issues. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so I'm going to get on to some of the strategies, some of the larger scale strategies for reweaving this fragmented whakapapa or kinship, so to reweaving our relationality with each other and and with the natural world. So some of this is the work of the Alliance for Intergenerational Resilience, which is a small Canadian not-for-profit that I've head up. And this was a gathering that we had in 2015 at Sayout First Nation. And it brought together Indigenous and non-Indigenous people aged between 17, and I was going to say 100 years, but that's not true, and 79 years. And we went through 4 intensive days of being together. In the first place, in the right-hand lower column, we started off being with the land and taking a decolonial reality tour. So getting underneath the colonial landscape to actually find out what the Indigenous, what was the Indigenous experience of that landscape. And then we made our way through. We had the Arts Child a partnership project, which was young artists working with elders, painting experiences of residential schools. We had intergenerational conversations and panels and dialogues. We had time of being on the land. One of the most powerful experiences of these 4 days was Auntie May Sam, the elder who held this together. And she sang in preparation beforehand and then during the summit, prayers into the land. And every morning we would come together and she would sing these prayers into our gathering. And this was a deep alchemy that was created that held these. Now, there's a lot that could have gone wrong at this summit, but held these diversity of experiences together. And then we moved through to innovation, right? To innovations of healing kinship relations. Some of the work that we're doing is creating intergenerational conversations through wisdom councils. And we've... the work on the right there is by Carmen Bear Bloomberg, and she's a young two-spirit artist. And we're holding conversations called Wisdom Councils, and we started when COVID-19 had just got underway and was shocking the world. I was still in Aotearoa. And the first one we held, and this actually, it's amazing, it speaks to the power of ceremony on Zoom. We held ceremony with each Wisdom Council, and it was palpable through the Zoom. The first one was called The Language of the Land, and we had youth and elders from Aotearoa and Vancouver Island speaking on what that meant to them, what the language of the land meant. The second one was with youth from Dishkanzibi here and traditional knowledge keepers, and youth from Vancouver Island, no, from Aluba, Scotland, sorry, and talking about intergenerational resilience and climate crisis. Where did they find themselves at this time, and what did intergenerational resilience, what did it mean to them? And one of the things that came out of these conversations was that the young people felt that they didn't really have the permission to really take up their traditional knowledge in the way that they needed and to apply this to the challenges that we have today. And this really came through particularly from a young Indigenous Gaelic woman in Scotland, but it also was voiced in various ways by some of the youth here. As a result, we're now actually holding, we're running a series of talking circles for Indigenous youth to look at this issue of intergenerational knowledge transmission and how was that flowing and what are the jolts. One of the things that we're also running within this is a circle for Two-Spirit and Indigiqueer people and then also for first and second generation racialised immigrant queer people. Now, why the importance of doing this is that if we think about kinship relations, right, we have very human constructions of, person, other species, man, woman, etc., that really permeates how we think about things. Creation doesn't actually go with that. Creation is just doing its thing. And so if you think about colonisation, and the reason that part of the reason that this even started is because I had a second generation racialised immigrant youth, queer youth, come to me, and colonised in his own land, coming here, displaced, right, deeply wanting to find connections to the Indigenous knowledge of place. So part of what we're also doing is growing kinship connections across these communities. Can we go to the next slide? Okay, can you go to the next slide? Thank you. So I'm just going to link these two issues. So this is another broad strategy that we're working with, and it's called radical hospitality or Indigenous-led migration. So normally, migrants don't have a lot to do with Indigenous people. Often and you might have heard, there's a statement by an Australian Aboriginal academic called Marcia Langdon, and she talks about the toxic relationship between Indigenous peoples and newcomers, simply because if you think about how you even have to go through citizenship test, there's very little about the Indigenous peoples of Turtle Island. I know because I've been through the citizenship test here, and it will be the same in Aotearoa, so it's no criticism of Turtle Island. But it so happens that there's opportunities for building, if we think about this collective journey and the connections that you're trying to build across your art and with each other. One of the things that we can do is that often immigrant people from the cultural and economic peripheries of the world, more recent immigrants to Canada, not white immigrants, carry with them Indigenous and traditional knowledge that often remains nascent because they come here and that knowledge gets suppressed because there's no place to express that, because it's all about basically enough money and how you're going to get by. So those constructions of citizenship are much narrower. But what kind of a world would we have if migration, all this radical hospitality, was led by Indigenous peoples, introducing newcomers to the Indigenous laws of place? Yep. So we've been working with several things, and this is one of the first things that we did. And this is my marae here, my whare tūpuna. And we had a couple of days where immigrant and refugee women from Eritrea, from Somalia, from Tonga, from Samoa, came and sat with the Ngaitarangi woman here and talked about what it meant to belong. This was the first time that my marae had immigrant and refugee women into an Indigenous into our meeting house. It was the first time, and I won't go into what that involved, but it was a very rich time actually that we had together, and there was a lot of connections made. Some of the other work that we've been doing has been to develop a Cree medicine wheel approach to working with racialised and immigrant women, newcomers, to belong to place. And that work has been going on in Toronto, and that involves land-based work as well, and healing in connection to the land. Patrick, how am I going for time? Oh, okay, I'm just going to, okay. So I'm not going to talk about the third strategy. And it's not like there's three strategies. There's many strategies. There's many kind of larger picture strategies. But I was very struck by a comment by, why can I not remember his name? By Anishinaabe legal scholar John Burroughs. And it was our last year at the WordFest festival here. And he was talking about legal laws and Indigenous legal laws, Anishinaabe legal laws and the laws of the place and what it would take to turn the ecology of this country around. And someone said to him, John, do you think everyone needs to know the Indigenous knowledge of place? And he told a story. And he said, his story was, he said, you know, when I was a boy, I used to watch my mother bake cakes. And I would watch her bake bread, actually, and I would watch her go through this whole process. And then the yeast, and infusing the yeast into that mixture. And thinking about how we make change is a bit like that. We need to think about that process, that yeast that helps the bread to rise, right? And where are the key spots where that yeast needs to go into if we want to think about accelerating change, yeah? And so you might think about GardenShip in the state. What are the yeasty spots, yep, that really put the power into this. So I want to finish with a song. It's a moon calendar song, and probably we won't. I think we'll probably have 4 minutes here too, unless you can fast forward it. But this is the moon calendar song, and it's sung by girls of 9 or 10 at Sowat First Nation. And I love this because it calls us into the future. And these are some of the wonderful things that are happening in terms of Indigenous language revitalisation. And don't forget, language, it shapes our mind, it shapes the futures that we create. So, yeah, if you could, can you fast forward it a bit to about 2 minutes in? Is that possible?
Rachel Hela.
Okay.
The one about the snatch, flats and up percentage. Hello everybody, my name is Grace. I'm to flats and up percentage. ATS and a Stilacha, Kea, ATS and a Stilacha Liqui. East Quest, and I'm at the Stilacha. This is my friend Kea and this is Liqui. We're going to be singing a song for you today.
Yeah, kia ora tātou. That's it.
Thank you so much, Lewis, for that stunning talk. I think we will definitely remember. We probably have time for, and you said so much more too, of course, but that I think was a great challenge. So we probably have a little bit of time for questions. Okay.
Is part Maori, and her mother is Maori. Her father is Greek, and her mother does the most beautiful weaving that I have at home. But about 4 years ago, they live on North Island. About 4 years ago, she wanted to move to South Island to be closer to her roots. So we always want to return from whence we come. We always want to know about those things. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Questions? Thoughts? Yes, I'm going to let you speak into the mic so we get you on tape, Sala.
Okay, I'm going to ask a hard question. So there's been a lot of controversy about lineage and indigeneity in Canada and the US, especially among academics and artists and writers. Queen's University had a report that came out questioning the authenticity of some of the faculty there. Do you have a position on that question? I mean, I've worked with colleagues in Michigan who basically came out and said, well, you know, I thought I was, but I'm not. You know, after they had careers as Indigenous scholars. You know, there's some pretty famous University of Michigan case.
Yeah. So, well, and you can see why Indigenous communities do question the authenticity. I think that's what you're talking about people who come in. Yeah, totally. And one in New Zealand, in Aotearoa, Linda Tuawai Smith talked about the doing your whakapapa research. So you know, knowing what your whakapapa is. I think, in my case, so intergenerationally displaced, I'm the only one in my family who's gone back. And that's been like a 20-year journey, yep. And some of the kuia and the kaumātua, the woman elders and the male elders, were very welcoming, but it took a lot of building those relationships, yep. And this is a really, I think, like knowing your place. Like, I would never speak to issues that relate to in terms of people having been there for people who've been there continuously, right? They're going to know more about some of those issues, right, than I do, right? The people who have had continuous occupation. So my position is that it's really, and people are rightly suspicious, because they haven't, Indigenous people haven't had a very good time with settlers coming, but then also, people coming into their communities and thinking like they know with some distant ancestry, and they don't know, and it's taken me 20 years to get to this spot, and that's been like going back home, learning Te Reo Māori, learning about Rongo Māori, building the relationships, and that's so it's all relational, And my auntie Maria, she used to say, it's all about relationships. So it's about activating that whakapapa, not just like having it, but like putting that into action. Yeah.
Thank you, Sala. Other questions? I wanted to ask you, I was thinking about the word reconciliation, which is so important and we hear so much. But I also was wondering about, in some of the ways that you're talking about the work that we need to do, is the word reconciliation, is it that you're talking about, or is reconciliation, I guess, a big enough word?
Okay, thanks, Pete. That's a good question. Well, to my understanding, there's lots of, there's the word reconciliation. Yes, I am talking that if it goes to very deep levels. And the word reconciliation is problematic in Canada because it's, from my understanding, here in Canada, Turtle Island, it started off with only in recent years with the residential school movement and truth telling around that. But reconciliation is much deeper than that, and reconciliation has to occur at those epistemological and those structural levels. So we're really, if you think about the depth, we're really only sort of down through the first little crust of reconciliation.
Yeah.
Yes, I always talk about those three levels: the epistemological, the relational, and the structural.
Right. Yeah. Thank you so much. Yes, Stephen?
You've been talking about decolonization, but in Europe, are they colonial? Or I know they're decolonizing the museums by sending objects back, but what do the Europeans have to do to change? What do they have to change to avoid global climate catastrophe, as you're saying?
So
what in their culture is that's destroying the world? If it's because they're not colonial, are they, or are they the mother of colonial?
Okay, I'm sorry, I'm not sure I understand the question. So I got a bit about the repatriation.
Well, that's sort of, they're trying to decolonize the museums in Europe. But I'm thinking, you're saying the problem here is the colonials caused the problem, but what caused the problem in Europe?
What caused the problem in Europe?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, to my knowledge, Europe parts of Western Europe.
Yes.
Represent the long ago colonized, right? So I know that some of my ancestors, right, from Scotland, for example, and that's only in relatively recent times. But you can, we cleared off the lands, and had to go to Aotearoa. Some came to Canada. So the colonisation that revels right back.
So you're talking about sort of a power structure.
Yeah.
Or not capitalism, because that was before capitalism, right? If you go back to like the Roman times where they colonized Europe or Northern Europe, that was not capitalism in a way.
But it's become more entwined with so colonization, right? To go and colonize another's lands, right? You're taking that over. But as time has gone on, it's become much more entwined with capitalism and then with global neoliberalism. And it's intensified, colonialism's intensified through the technology that we have and through our global systems. So what might have started off as one system, if you go back to the Romans and the Romans colonizing England, of displacement and systematic displacement has intensified because of and it's rapidly intensified, to my way of thinking, in the last couple of 100 years and in the last 100 years because of these global technological financial systems.
The capitalism that sat it on top.
Late capitalism.
Yeah. Or the oil industry.
Yeah. So. Oh, the oil industry. Yes, right. I was tying the fossil fuel industry into murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls and two-spirited people. Yeah.
I think this has to be the last question, or we'll miss our snacks.
Well, I don't have. It's maybe too big a question for the last question, but I'll try anyway. Just to build on that, I guess when I was listening to your talk, and it was wonderful. Thank you very much. I was thinking about, kinship systems of governance, and then about centralized governments. And centralized governments tended to try to crush that, right? And that, in some ways, is a kind of pattern in history, right? So we're at a moment when we see a lot of centralization. We see totalitarian governments. And so those things need to be resisted. And I think what I'm hearing you say is to look to previous kinship and look to indigenous knowledge and maybe systems. But the challenge, I guess, is those big centralized systems need to be challenged by big centralized things, right? Do you get what I mean? So I don't know. I mean, it's an impossible question. It's an impossible question. But I do think about, well, is there things from colonial histories like liberal democracy that should be maintained? Or is it, does that have to go? You see what I mean? Is that something that can combat these things?
I think there's a lot. I'm not saying like down with Westernization. No. Because I think there's valuable things from every culture, right? And so it's not this kind of binary good, bad. But what I am saying is that if we can bring these kinship relations, and if this is our fundamental epistemology, and then within that, we put our technology and we put the other things that brought us into so-called modernity, that is the way to go. And the West had relational epistemologies and worldviews once as well. Everyone has that in their lineage. I think in terms of the power structures and centralization, it's a real problem. And in terms of even how they address how climate change is being addressed, it's often from this corporate top-down approach. And yet there are communities who are taking back control and coming from an Indigenous governance perspective. I personally believe that, and this is when I sort of talked about we are in the midst. I think there's going to be a lot more, collapse before we start to build again. But I mean, sure, the power structures are big. What else can you do? But do what you think is the right thing in terms of this kinship repair. Yeah.
I think that's a very challenging and hopeful note to end on, and I think we will end. So I want to ask you to join me in thanking deeply Lewis for her talk.